필리핀하고 할 때 뭐 시스템이 다른 걸로 하는 것 같더라. 내가 너한테 포워딩 했지.
네.
화면 공유로 들어갈까?
네.
오카와 앤 러서프스키를 먼저 해야지. Okay, before I start my lecture, sorry that I had to give you somewhat different time frame.
교수님 끄셨나요?
내가 다시. This is Wikipedia. No, this is not the one. Okay, I should. 하고.
제가 찾을게요.
어디가 공유했어?
교수님 끄셔가지고 잠시만요.
여기 있잖아 하나 보면.
아니 근데 그건 다른 파일이에요. 교수님 방금
파일이?
아예 끄셔가지고 파일이 사라졌어요. 이거 맞죠?
오케이. lecture 1. Okay, I'm opening my lecture 1 series on Japanese economic growth. Original contribution was made by Okawa and Rosovsky. I know very well the work of Professor Okawa. He was a pioneering scholar in Japan who was based in Hitotsubashi University, where I also served as a visiting professor 2 times. Okawa is known for his study on capital stock and long-term economic statistics series for Japan. I learned from his work a lot of studies. So he was kind of predecessor in this field. Of course, in Japanese statistics, I applied most of his technique to Korean studies. Okay, Okawa, he was a kind of orthodox and traditional economist, veteran economist on Japanese economic growth. He co-worked with Professor Rosovsky, whose expertise was on Japanese economic growth. I believe he was from Stanford University. So I'm using their kind of textbook, not textbook, but their contribution, Japanese economic growth, and to roughly sort of cover from the modernization period, Meiji Restoration period, to probably the end of 1945. That period, I'm using Okawa and Rosovsky's text contribution book. Okay, but their book is very good in the sense that they start from a little bit earlier period in Japanese economic history, pre-modern background. In other words, modernization before modernization occurred. So 100 years ago, the mid-19th century, the world economy, European powers at center stage, US just emerging as a major contestant for world power. In Asia, India, colony, China, attractive for colonial ambitions due to vast population and resources. India was simply a colony of British Empire, but China was very attractive for colonial ambitions due to vast population and resources. Today, Europe's role was relatively diminished, but Russia and US became superpowers, and China ever becoming stronger. Japan became a major industrial power, its GDP third after US and Soviet Union. So this is a kind of a preview of Japanese becoming one of major industrial power. And Japan's transformation for modernization is not confined to economics. Nearly all facets of current life. Japan became world leader, the only country of non-European origin to have achieved full modernization by three spurts. So after the Russo-Japanese War, this was a very critical moment. The Russo-Japanese War, you probably have learned last week at the end of Chinese economic history, we mentioned the Qing-Japan War, China-Japan War. And after that, Russo-Japanese War, and in this war, Russian fleet, Russian Far Eastern fleet kind of defeated by the Japanese fleet. And Japan consolidated the power around Korean Peninsula, Manchuria. And that moment became very critical, and that's why Japan got into the Manchuria area, invaded China after defeating Russia in 1905. And after that, World War I began, and very rapid development followed by slower growth during the 1920s, economic growth-wise. So 1930s developed a most impressive pace in Japanese economic history. From the period of 1931 to 1937. So remember, this is the period just after World Depression. World global economy originated from Wall Street in the United States, 1929, Great Depression. And after Great Depression, Japanese economy made an impressive pace, impressive record setting sort of economic growth. GNP growth rate was averaging 5.7%. By that period standard, it is very impressive. So that sort of made Japan overconfident and ultimately leading the country into the war against United States and Soviet Union in allied forces, and got defeated by 1945. So this is a very turbulent economic history from Japanese perspective. And then three parts. First part, as I mentioned, from 1917 to World War I, 1915, 1918, 4.56%. That was the first Japanese kind of economic spot. And then 1920s, it was due to Great Depression. World market was very stagnant, and financial industries in the United States went to all bankruptcy. Remember 1929 Great Depression. And then the second spot followed 1931, 1937. And finally, 1956, 1962, third spot, averaging 10.72%. So Japan's economic miracle based on absorption of modern Western technology by private investments was made possible, you know. So you can remember these three economic spots in modern Japanese economic history. Okay. Before 1968, traditional feudal rule of the Tokugawa shogunate. Shogunate means kingdom, basically. Tokugawa period kingdom. Not much different from other backward Asian countries. Very traditional feudal societies. The restoration of the Meiji Emperor fronted for a new government for economic growth. So 1868 became Meiji Emperor period. And that we call Meiji Restoration. Restoration means rebuilding everything. Okay. So reform plus rebuilding plus major revolution. All these things together we call restoration, political restoration. Toward the end of Tokugawa rule in the 1850s, 80% as peasants with average size of plus slightly less than 1 hectare, but some worked in crafts and trade in cities. And this you learned when we studied Korean economy. You may remember. There was a chapter on Japan and Korea, the acreage comparison. And Japan was the only country which had less cultivated area per farmer. You know, in other words, Japan was narrower in terms of acreage being cultivated by each farmer, narrower space than Republic of Korea, I mean south than Korean Peninsula. So Japan had to have a very intensive rice cropping, and that was the reason why Japan had to get into Korean Peninsula, invaded Korean Peninsula, and trying to colonize, and also invaded Manchuria because they thought that they could not support their population by rice cropping, and they could not afford cultivating their land, and they had to invade Japan, Korean Peninsula and Manchuria to obtain more crops. You may remember in my lecture about Korean economy, Korea's main export item was rice during 1910, 1945, Korea's colonial period, being the Japanese Empire, being ruled by Japanese Empire. That means rice was very expensive at the time. Korea could import about 3 times more tonnage, more crops, non-rice items, maybe barley and other crops, corns and so forth, in exchange for rice, so that Korea could also support their population. You remember that was the Korean economy learning. You were learning that from Korean economy, and that is repeated here. Okay, so Tokugawa period is basically before Meiji Restoration, was covering roughly about 300 years, 250 years, roughly 265 years. Almost similar to Lee Dynasty, Lee Kingdom in Korean history. And craft and services used labor-intensive methods that depended for gains in productivity on the skills of the individual worker. Fixed capital was only a minor element in the production function. So mostly handmade skills and skill intensive. In 1637, closing of the country. This is a very kind of key word. In Korean, we read this as 쇠국. 쇠 means it's kind of 쇠 means keys, and key to the nation, and key is locked. In other words, the nation is locked. The meaning of sakoku, closing of the country, the nation is just closed up, not open. And in Japanese, we read that sakoku, and in Korean, we read that 쇠국. And the English translation is closing of the country, non-open state. And that decree by Shogun Iemitsu was made in 1867, shakoku, 쇠국, that is closing of the country. The only exception was the Dutch and the Chinese allowed limited trading rights in Nagasaki. That's why Nagasaki, the city in southern part of Japan, near, I think, near Hiroshima and south of Osaka, Nagasaki was the most open city in Japanese history, because on the sakoku, closing of the country, Japan allowed very limited exception to the Dutch and the Chinese for their own need. They wanted to import some, let's say, expensive items, like typically some perfume, or from Chinese, some very expensive silk, for example, things like that. Only those could be imported into Nagasaki, limited opening. But Commodore Perry, this is very famous story, and his ships finally opened Japan in 1800. And isolation policy may have created sources of inner strength to some extent. An industrial revolution in Great Britain, absence of international contacts, only second-best technology and organization was available. So population at early 1600s, 25 million. In the 1860s, 30 million. And 1700, 1840s, 150 years, population remained stable due to infanticide. Infanticide means in Japanese, mabiki. Mabiki means, basically infants being killed, at early stage. So infants' death rate was very high during this period. Therefore, even though population, even though birth rate continued to grow due to infant mortality, high infant mortality, population became almost stable during this period. Japan during the Tokugawa period very vigorous, advanced, and effective traditional society, and we call that a centralized feudalism. Usually, feudalism is based on localization. In other words, locally very strong kingdom or shogunate rules the local city or local towns, local prefecture. But Japanese characteristic of Tokugawa period in Japan, to some extent, is very centralized feudalism, more advanced than many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Low per capita income, who was very low in poor organization, corruption, lethargy, almost like coma state or slumber state. In Korean, we read 무기력, means non-vigorous power. So non-lively, not lively, 무기력 means. Okay, so lethargy and undernourishment. Nourishment was not enough. Okay, so these were the characteristics.
Like among different kinds of cultural value,
Characteristics: poor organization, corruption, lethargy, and undernourishment was the state. Effective at both central and local government. The capital and the major cities were under direct control. 200 baronies or fiefs headed by a lord or daimyo gets income stream. So a privilege to levy a yearly harvest tax. Okay.
Like racism, conflict, and how do people focus on that situation, how they emphasize.
So the road system of pre-modern Japan, major arteries crisscross the country, and both goods and people moved relatively very rapidly. And we tell this period as Sankin Kotai, means there was an alternate residence, 1 year in capital and 1 year in the provinces. That is Sankin Kodai, means local king, for example, or local boss or local shogun is supposed to live 1 year in capital, for example, Osaka or Kyoto, or that probably Kyoto, and 1 year in the provinces, maybe in Sendai or in Fukuoka, or in, for example, Tohoku area, or in Hokkaido area. So that means their family became hostage to the main king. So therefore, in other words, they leave their family as hostage in capital city, and they go to their local city in provinces. Therefore, they become very good behavior. In other words, they cannot run any kind of anti-government or anti-kingdom movement. They cannot make war. They cannot antagonize the main kingdom. So prevented a rival and local power base. Colorful daimyo procession was made. What is daimyo procession? That is, for example, the little king, local king from Sendai area. Suppose he wanted to go back from capital city, Kyoto, to Sendai, all the way. We call that as colorful daimyo procession. So roads and inns, restaurants are all trying to welcome his procession. You know, he travels himself. He does not travel by himself. He and his followers big family and big subordinates will make a procession. And that procession will develop roads, inns, restaurants, and so forth. So this is a kind of very unique cultural feature, Sankin Kodai. And that was originated from the idea that central government did not want to have local king permanently reside in localities and make hostile movement war against central kingdom. So we call that as Sankin Kodai era. Housing and clothing, indigenous dress beautiful, and cuisine nutritional and attractive. Attractive foods were served, developed. Okay. Edo, Tokyo, Kyoto, Osaka, among the largest cities in the world, high average standard of education. 40 to 50% males formal schooling. This is a very high level of education by that period standard, by the standard of that period. Official class structure was a bushi, samurai, gentry, farmers, and merchants. In Tokugawa Japan, the gap between economic and other backwardness was unusually large, made the prospects of modern economic growth all the more promising. Okay. The capability of borrowing and absorbing more advanced methods based on well-functioning socio-political infrastructure, meaning that education, fundamental factor became in Japan's later success. Okay. So in other words, Japanese economic miracle, economic success story did not come overnight. It had a long history of accumulation of human capital. Okay. And then Meiji Restoration, January 1868, was made. The last Tokugawa shogun voluntarily surrendered power to the imperial family. In other words, this is the very symbolic incident, historical event, in the sense that localized power became central power. In other words, the younger Emperor Meiji became truly king of Japan, an epochal event in Japanese history, a favored example of modernization. And that they call this is the beginning year of Japanese modernization, 1868. What happened to the Republic of Korea by 1868? Republic of Korea, Lee dynasty was under Lee dynasty, was not really in the brink of modernization. They were struggling internal politics during this period. They did not open their port. And almost like 20 years after they started opening port, and almost 1905, 1910, after 50 years, Lee dynasty and Imperial Korea became sort of colonialized and then started being modernized. And you remember China. What happened to China? 1868. China was very much, many parts of China were colonized by, Hong Kong and Macau and so forth. And as you remember, Opium War broke out, and China was struggling internally, politically, and the Communist Party and National Party became emerged. So modernization of China could not begin during this period. the only East Asian power which began consolidating their power internally, and then began centralized government, and began Meiji Restoration, and began sort of modernization period, was Japan. A renewed foreign threat came, but no more isolation, but modernization. Discontented lower-ranking samurai was there, of course. Some samurai which occupied upper class were not satisfied by Tokugawa shogun, particularly lower-ranking samurai. But a secular economic deterioration as a result of rising expenditure by the Tokugawa and other domains happened to some extent. The years of transition, the Meiji period can be divided into two periods. Transition period, roughly 20 years from 1868 to 1885, and growth period from 1886 to 1900 period. The years of transition, first sub-period, initial shock of Western contact was observed, the institutional reform spearheaded by the government. Court noble, warriors, peasants, merchants, and outcasts, two new classes, a small nobility and everyone. So by 1876, pensioning off all warriors, 200 million yen, opened all internal travels and ports to external visitors. So this is Kurofune refers to Mississippi, Plymouth, Saratoga, and Susquehanna of the Perry expedition for the opening of Japan, which was made during the period 1852-1854. That arrived on July 14, 1856. You remember Meiji Restoration occurred 1868. So this Perry Kurofune, Kuro means black color. Fune means ship, black ship. So black ships arrived before Meiji Restoration. So this black ship arrival and forced opening of Japan under the command of U.S. Commander Matthew Perry made Japan to go through Meiji Restoration because they realized that world is different. When they were open to this outside world, Japan realized that they needed to really consolidate their power. They needed to form central government under the name of Meiji Restoration. So if you remember this Meiji Restoration occurred 1868, you should remember before that, the definite event then made that 1853. So 1853 and 1868, after about 15 years after black ship's arrival, Japan became really starting their modernization under the name of Meiji Restoration. And black refers to the black color of the older sailing vessels and the black smoke from the coal-fired steam engines of the American ships. In this sense, the Kurofune became a symbol of the ending of isolation. You see, now opening ports, avoiding isolation, departing from isolation, could make the history of economic history very different, and Japanese modernization began. Turning point, the momentous events that created modern Japan. I quoted from YouTube. I guess you can click this. And Russo-Japanese War occurred 1904 and September 1905. Please remember, if you remember Korean history, what was the period in Korea? Korea was annexed to Japan in 1910, right? So 1904, 1905 is the period just before Korea being annexed to Japan. Still, Russo-Japanese War, Russia was fighting against Japan to take over hegemony in Korean Peninsula. There was a history, Korea king once ran away from his kingdom, avoiding Japanese military attack, to run away to Russian embassy. And we call Agwan Pachon. Agwan means Russian embassy in Chinese character. Pachon means king's residence has moved. So Agwan Pachon is the historical event in Korea's late dynasty, Lee dynasty's kingdom. King himself tried to evade to Russian embassy around this period, 1904, 1905, as I remember, to protect himself from Japanese aggression. And what happened is Russo-Japanese War ended with Japan winning the war. So that's why Korea was fast annexed to Japan in terms of colony. If by accident Russia has won this war against Japan, Korea might have avoided being annexed to Japan. This is a very interesting and very memorable to some extent East Asian history. And South Manchuria and Korean Peninsula, that's the war site. Yodong Peninsula Sea area for dominance in Manchuria and Korea. And Japan attacked Russian warships at Port Arthur. Okay, this is the slide that I obtained, Russo-Japanese War. You see Korea, North Korea here, South Korea here. This is Yodong Hando, Yodong Peninsula. This is almost like peninsula. And Russo-Japanese War. Port Arthur is here. I don't know why the name of port is in American or in Russian language. Port Arthur here. This should be Chinese port by now. I think this is Dairen right now, Dairen Hangu. Okay, this is the main area for the war. Now, I obtained some pictures, Russo-Japanese War, very brutal war. And also from Russian side, very, memorable picture you can see. See here, Russo-Japanese War. So during this period, we briefly reviewed this period, late 19th century in Japan. Let us take a look at some important topics. Agricultural reform made in the 1870s in Japan. Okay, the land ownership from the emperor to peasants who have to pay heavy land tax to the central and local government. The tax was levied on asset valuation of the land at nationally uniform levels. Currency and banking reforms created the Bank of Japan in 1889, establishing regulations in private banking system. Model factories, foreign experts hiring, and sending students abroad was made, right? So fairly early period, 1889, the Bank of Japan was established. Even though this is very symbolic meaning, has symbolic meaning, you know, this is very economic implication is very significant because not many nations created central bank in late 19th century. Not many nations. As I remember, only England, British economy, and the United States at the most. So, but then meaning that the Bank of Japan was established in 1889, Japanese economy was very actively being modernized. Otherwise, there was no need to form central bank. And to form central bank has meaningful implications because it can regulate private banking system. So private banking system cannot be established without creating central bank. Model factories, foreign experts, hiring and sending students abroad could be made, right? But severe inflation followed by a harsh Matsukata deflation by 1885. That means severe inflation, hyperinflation, and then followed by great deal of price falling down, deflation by 1885. 15 years after 1885, uninterrupted development of modern industry, silk, and cotton spinning. So 1885 to roughly 1900, Japanese economy was making peaceful progress. Road building, railroads, general public works by the government was made possible. So this period's structure of the Meiji economy can be reviewed here. If we could review it. Manufacturing and mining, for example, we can sort of, in terms of 1934, 1936 prices, that means a real price, right? Output by industry has been doubled between this period. And agriculture increased sharply. Manufacturing has been doubled, you can see, right? And also, for example, gainfully occupied population from 1887 to 1902, agriculture was not made any progress, declined shortly, but manufacturing and mining increased sharply. So this is a kind of beginning industrialization in Japanese. Very early beginning of industrialization. So this is their chart showing, for example, GNP from 1887 to 1970 in constant prices. You can see this break during the, World War II. Before that, A is actual series, B is smoothed series. Smoothed means usually seasonal adjustment or moving average smoothing, almost the same series, you can see. So you can see here, this period was made very slow progress, but persistent progress, no break, no sharply marked down recession. And then this slump occurred during the World War II period, and then very high rising, very speedy economic progress from 1950 to 1970. GNP and GNP per capita, estimates and alternative estimates. Roughly, you can see the statistics. Also, average annual growth rate of growth source, you can see early period sort of industrialization during this period, right? And three speed up spurts mentioned. First spurt, second spurt, and third spurt. And then after 1945, very rapid post-war growth period. Okawa and Rosovsky's statistics shows that between average levels, for example, there was a steady economic growth and slight slump, 1931 to 1937, but again, very lively economic peak reached. And in terms of schematic growth path, log scale GNP is depicted against years, and they can show this is just the same diagram as this one, and just theoretically they are sketching sort of schematic growth path, which is very resembling this one, okay? Okay, so that ends the first part. And second part of my picture slide, I will open up. 공유 중지를 하고 일단 그지 나가서 화면 공유로 다시 가서 여기로 가서 공유를 해요. Okay. This slide, this lecture 2 consists of longer history of economic growth, compiled from Wikipedia, basically. Okay. So this should be rather long economic history. And what I will do, I will pick up post-World War II period only. I want you to read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sub-periods. Some of the period, like Meiji period, may be redundant with what we discussed so far, lecture 1. But I want you to read subsection 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so that can be linked to sub-period 5, post-World War II, okay? Okay. Let me begin. Because we covered the Meiji period. Okay, so let me begin with the slide number 19, early 20th century. Even though it might be a little bit redundant, it might have a little bit more interesting slides. So by 1928, the GNP of Japan at current prices peaked at 16,000 million yen in the mid-1930s. The Japanese nominal wage rates was 1/10 of US wage rate. 10% of US wage rate based on mid-1930s exchange rate, while price of Japan remained 44% of price of United States. Okay, so let's take a look at this data briefly. Okay. So country listed GDP per capita and GDP PPP per capita in $1990, GDP PPP capita in $1990. And let me explain what this PPP means. And these people are the scholars who compiled this statistics estimates. Liu Ta-chung and also Fukao, Professor Fukao from Hitotsubashi University, also a very close associate of mine. We created the Asia Claims Productivity Study Research Consortium back 12 years ago. And he was a representative of Japan side. And we created Asia Claims Research Consortium. Medicine, I think he died several years ago. He's a Dutch economist who was making frequent visit to Korea and also Japan. He was an economic historian. And I met with Professor Medicine many times at Hitotsubashi conference back in 1990s and 20s, 200s. So these are the scholars that I know very well. And what they had compiled is something like this. GDP per capita in 1935 dollars. That means after inflation adjusted. What is GDP per capita? Per person GDP, per person. So nominal GDP is deflated by 1935 dollars, real GDP, and then deflated by population. So US, $540, Japan, excluding Taiwan and Korea. By the way, this is about when? This must be by 1928 or something like that. So by 1928, that means Japan occupied Taiwan and Korea. Taiwan and Korea was part of Japan, colonies. So at any rate, at that time, per capita GDP, isn't it interesting figure? China was so backward, only $18. US was $540 in real GDP dollars, in real US dollars. Taiwan was ahead of Korea. Always Taiwan was ahead of Korea because Taiwan was more rich in terms of agricultural production. Warm weather, good soil, Taiwan's productivity was very high. So Taiwan's production amount was larger than Korea. What is GDP PPP? PPP means purchasing power parity. What is this concept? Okay, purchasing power parity is exchange rate reflected GDP adjustment. What is exchange rate reflected GDP? We used to call this PPP index. The best indicator of a PPP is we call McBurger index. McDonald's Big Mac. There used to be a McDonald's Big Mac index. So Big Mac price in New York could be $5. And in Korea, it could be 7,001. And in Russia, I don't know, maybe 3 rubles or 10 rubles, and so forth. So, in other words, each country's exchange rate reflected adjusted GDP and real prices. According to that, by 2007, okay, US was 5,590, Japan 1,745, Taiwan was 1,260, and about half of that, Korea and China. According to Madison, in 1935, they figured PPP adjusted is 5590, the same, but Madison's statistics shows a little bit different. Taiwan 1212, Korea 1225, and China 562. Probably Madison's purchasing power parity estimate was different from Fukao's per PPP index. Okay, so what is the conclusion? Japan was well ahead of the rest of East Asian nations, but still Japan was lagging far behind United States by 1935. Okay. Before World War II, Japan built an extensive empire, Taiwan, Korea, Manchuria, Northern China. Political and economic necessity to secure raw materials, I told you, and crucial sea lanes imported large amounts of coal from Korea, Manchuria, and occupied China. Since 1868, you remember, by that time, coal was the most important energy source of power, right? Coal-fired engines were everywhere. So since 1868, 2 periods of economic development followed. The first period, Russo-Japanese War, repeated from the previous slide, 65% of employment and 30% of GDP was still based on agriculture, but the modern industry had begun to expand substantially after Russo-Japanese War. During the war, World War I, in the absence of the war-torn European competitors, Japan advanced to generate a trade surplus for the first time since the isolation in the Edo period. By the late 1920s, GDP contributed by agriculture, 21%, manufacturing and mining, 23%, service, 56%, including transportation and communications, to sustain heavy industrial development. In the 1930s, Japan suffered less from the Great Depression. GDP expanded at 5% per year, Manufacturing and mining accounted for more than 30% of GDP, more than 2 times of agricultural GDP. But most of industrial growth was geared toward expanding the nation's military power. Beginning in 1937, with significant land seizures in China and annexations and invasions across Southeast Asia, the Pacific Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It's a very long word, but in Korean we call 대동아 공영권. 대 means great, 동 means east, A means Asia. So Greater Asia Co-Prosperity. In other words, under the slogan by Japanese Empire that we should make progress, we should achieve prosperity jointly. Japan not alone. We have to achieve our prosperity in allied fashion. That's the slogan made by Japanese Empire. 대동아 공영권, Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. To secure natural resources for economic independence. Coal in China, sugarcane in the Philippines, petroleum from Dutch East Indies, colonialized by the Dutch, had a lot of petroleum. Burma too, and the tin and bauxite from the Dutch East Indies and Malaya. Name everything. Everything is available from East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. That's the slogan, Japanese Empire. Early stages of Japan's expansion benefited large industrial conglomerates called zaibatsu. Another form in Korea was Jebel. And this was very much resembled in Korean. Steel production, 6 million tons, increased to 8.8 million tons. In 1941, Japanese aircraft industry had the capacity of manufacturing 10,000 aircrafts per year. That's very large production capacity. Pacific War broke out, 1943 to 45. Japan and occupied territories suffered severely. Inflation became rampant, military needs and became commercial requirements and severe shortfalls. That means a lot of production was made for military needs, not enough for commercial requirements. As a result, production amount was not enough, inflation occurred, severe shortfalls occurred. By the end of war in 1945, shortages of foods and shortages of goods, inflation, currency devaluation, Japanese economy virtually standstill. Oh, by the way, let me introduce at this point one novel recently I purchased a novel by Lee Dong Min. The title is what is the Eugene gambling site in Japan? Gambling in Japan. 내가 그 소설을 한번 찾아봐. gambling.
도박 일본어로.
일본어로 또.
갸도로?
어?
갸도로? 소설 이름이에요?
Okay, this is I found it. Pachinko, meaning is gambling, okay? And it's in English. And it became very famous novel. It is basically 3 generation Korean family story, immigrant into Osaka area. Very impressive, Osaka. I enjoyed reading this in Korean, translated version. I strongly recommend you to read this novel if you can get it in English. If you know of a Korean translated version. Okay. The war wiped out many of the gains which Japan had made since 1868. About 40% of nation industrial plants, infrastructure were destroyed, and production reverted to levels of about 15 years earlier. You can see that. You showed that, in the previous chart diagram, Okawa's chart, 1945, Japan restarted from the level 15 years ago, so 1930 level. Okay, so 15 years earlier. C. As Japan's second period of economic development began, millions of former soldiers joined a well-disciplined and highly educated workforce to rebuild Japan. Japan's colonies were lost as a result of the World War II, but since then, the Japanese had extended their economic influence throughout Asia and beyond. A variety of US-sponsored measures during the occupation, such as land reform, contributed to the economy's later performance by increasing competition. US assistance totaled US 1.9 billion during the occupation, or about 15% of nation's imports and 4% of GNP in that period. About 59% of this aid was in the form of food, 15% in industrial materials, 12% in transportation equipment. The economy, Japanese economy, benefited from foreign trade because it was able to expand exports rapidly enough to pay for imports of equipment and technology without falling into debt, as had a number of developing nations in the 1980s. So Korea was not an exception. Korea was very much following Japanese example. That is, Korea starting from 1960s was able to expand exports rapidly, as you learned, enough to pay for imports of equipment and technology. You see, Japan's 1950-1960 experience was emulated, repeated in case of Republic of Korea. Gifts from heaven. Bloodless democratic revolution from above, ushered in by US forces that put an end to a socially debilitating war. And so, in other words, the post-war World War II was kind of gifts from heaven in the sense that created bloodless revolution. Reforms made extending the right to vote to women, strengthening labor unionization, liberalizing the economy, the massive business conglomerates known Zaibatsu had effectively controlled the Japanese economy for almost 100 years, were also broken up and faced market competition. Law for the elimination of excessive economic concentration, law on the expulsion of Zaibatsu-affiliated controls. All these laws were repeated in the Republic of Korea to control their 재벌, another Zaibatsu form. The early post-war years were devoted to rebuilding lost industrial capacity. Major investments were made in electric power, coal, steel, and chemicals. Between 1953-1965, GDP expanded by more than 9% per year. Manufacturing and mining by 13%, construction by 11%, and infrastructure by 12%. In 1965, these sectors employed more than 41% of the labor force, whereas only 26% remained in agriculture. Japan's highly acclaimed post-war education system contributed strongly to the modernizing process. The 1973 oil crisis shocked an economy that had become dependent on imported petroleum. Although the investment costs were high, many energy-intensive industries successfully reduced their dependence on oil. during the late 1970s, 1980s, and enhanced their productivity. Advances in microcircuitry and semiconductors in the late 1970s and 1980s led to new growth industry in consumer electronics and computers. This is a Japanese period, very strong industrial power in consumer electronics and computers, and to a higher productivity in pre-established industries. Japan experienced slower growth in the mid-1980s, but its demand-sustained economic boom of the late 1980s revived many troubled industries. About this third statement, then you may question to me why Japan suddenly lost comparative advantage in consumer electronics and computers to the South Korean consumer electronics giants and computers such as Samsung and LG Lucky Gold Star. Why did it happen? Of course, it is a natural phenomena that technological is adopted by advanced countries, followed by, caught up by latecomers, and another followers like China will overtake, for example, comparative advantage by South Korean electronics firms and semiconductor firms. It's natural phenomena. You move from top, most advanced nations, enterprises, to the lower advanced enterprises. But in addition to that, why the process was so fast, to my judgment, is because Japan became superpower and Japanese electronics giants like Sony, Fujitsu, Toshiba, and all these computer companies, semiconductors, were trying to protect their national standard. You see, there is a competition in adopting international standard. That is software behind this, for example, mobile phone. Software system, we call CP, content product provider, and Japan did not open to content provider international competition. Japan tried to protect local content provider that is purely genuine Japanese language adopted, software. So what happened? Apple, Samsung, all these latecomers to some extent were opening their protocol to international, free CP, content provider, free competition. So that, for example, why, what is the, Facebook or YouTube, why was it mounted to Apple system? Why wasn't it mounted to Japanese system, Japanese protocol? Because that much Korean mobile phones or Apple mobile phones try to open their content to international competition. That's very important. If you want to protect your national interest, you cannot protect your national interest. You have to open your system. When you open your system becomes competition. So, for example, there was an intense competition, domestic competition within Republic of Korea between Samsung and Lucky Gold Star. But we put their competition laissez-faire. That is, we didn't bother, we didn't intervene. You try to survive on your own. Recently, ultimately, Lucky Gold Star failed in further promotion of their mobile phones. They failed. So they have to give up mobile phone business, concentrate on consumer electronics like their famous TV sets and refrigerator sets and all these things. So to some extent, Japan failed in promoting their industrial competitiveness by protecting their industry too much, not opening their software market protocol system to international standard. And that sort of had made the process of catch-up speedier. Right now, of course, Korean companies are facing with the same problem, being chased by Chinese competitors. Okay. Nation's pre-war experience, Tokugawa period, vital commercial sector in burgeoning urban center, well-educated elite, and we covered this, and Meiji period and post-war growth period. Level of quality and quality of investment was very high. Japan as latecomer to modernization. Of course, South Korea was another latecomer to modernization, and China was latecomer to modernization. Labor force, very highly skilled and educated labor force was behind this latecomers modernization. High productivity growth. Economies of scale. Before World War II, large holding companies formed wealth groups, Zaibatsu, but Zaibatsu were dissolved after the war. But Geiretsu means subcontractors, subsidiary companies. Subsidiary companies of Toyota, 300 or 500 subsidiary companies. Large modern industrial enterprise groupings emerged. The coordination of activities within these groupings and the integration of smaller subcontractors into the groups enhanced industrial efficiency through economies of scale. Economies of scale meaning that largeness pay off. That is, larger as you group these subcontractors, they can benefit from economies of scale. Growth-oriented cooperation policy strategy followed. Product diversification occurred. International conflicts occurred. Agricultural sector, as late as 1955, 40% of labor force still worked in agriculture, 17% by 1970. Now, by 21st century, under 5%. Japan's economic growth in the 60s, 70s was based on the rapid expansion of heavy manufacturing in such as automobile, steel, shipbuilding, chemicals, and electronics. South Korea's economic growth followed this pattern exactly with a time lag of 10 years, 20 years. From the late 1970s, the Japanese economy began to move away from heavy manufacturing toward a more service-oriented tertiary sector, service sector base. Post-World War 1980s, world's third largest GNP country became Japan. Except a mild economic slump in the mid-1980s, economic expansion in 1986, 1992, but that was followed by 2 decades of lost decades of Japan. So my terminology is 2 lost decades of Japan followed. Unlike the economic booms of 1960s and 1970s, when increasing exports played a key role in economic expansion, domestic demand propelled the Japanese economy in the late 1980s. Economic restructuring from dependence on exports to reliance on domestic demand. Post-World War II, 1980s, through growth in high technology industries resulted from heightened domestic demand for higher living, better medical care and more welfare, expanded leisure time facilities, improves ways to accommodate rapidly aging society. During the 1980s, the Japanese economy shifted its emphasis from primary and secondary activities to processing, telecommunication, computers, increasingly vital. So this is the situation. After 1989 economic bubble, lost decade of the end of 20th century, and I mentioned this already in the form of 2 lost decades of Japan, and very deflation-like from 1990s to present. For example, ramen price in Japan. When I went to Japan first time, early 1980s, it was 300 yen per dish, per ramen. Now, still in Tokyo, ramen price is 300 yen per dish. Unbelievable. That's very long-term stagnation of the Japanese economy. And some of the charts that I showed you here will show you some of my research work. I will only highlight one thing here. This was the chart that I published at the University of Tokyo policy discussion series with my PhD student then, Dr. Nam. This shows, I wish this was made in color. It was not made in color form. You can see it here. This is the Japan's rate of return. How do I calculate rate of return to capital? Is from GDP, you deduct wage rate times labor, working hours, all working hours time wage rate. This will be wage bill, and that will be what? What I define income from capital. This income from capital is deflated by capital stock. So per capital output, per capital, how much earning wage income. In other words, this W times L is wage rate times working hours. This is wage bill. If you deduct wage bill from GDP accounting, you have income to capital. This is income to capital. Okay. Return to capital and divide by capital stock. This is what I mean, ratio of return to capital. Okay, that should be equal to ratio of return to capital is equal to ratio of return to capital is equal to this, right? Okay. So if I show you this, in early 1970s, two countries return to capital. You see, this dotted line is Japan first. Japan's rate of return sharply declining. Korea was very also high and following Japanese pattern with roughly 10-year time lag. And Japan's all of a sudden experienced declining rates of return around Plaza Accord. This is Plaza Accord. So today's class assignment to you is please go to Google search or whatever. My class assignment to you is, what is Plaza Accord? Simply putting, Plaza Accord was happening around 1984, around this time. In New York Plaza Hotel, G7 countries, including Japan, got together and pressured Japan to appreciate their yen. When they appreciate their yen from, for example, 140 yen per dollar to 100 yen, then makes Japanese products more expensive, right? So Japanese export is hurt all of a sudden by the pressure United States and European side. So their rates of return fell sharply. Korea follows Japan with time, 10-year lag. And near 1995, Korea's rate of return is even lower than OECD average. Japan's rate of return was lower than, by 1995, OECD average. That was the story. Very rapidly falling rates of return. Okay, so I want you to study about Plaza Accord. Do independent research on Plaza Accord, please. Okay, and come back with your explanation of Plaza Accord. And you can write a short report on Plaza Accord about this picture and submit as a class assignment, optional class assignment. Okay, so I will stop here for today. Sorry that I have to rush to meeting. Today, probably I will receive your comments, your questions only by email, and I should be able to return to you by email, okay? Hope to see you next week. Thank you for your attention. Kora.